Lon Chaney's makeup as the Phantom of the Opera was so frightening that all photographs were banned before the release. This made the kids flock to the movie, eager but somewhat nervous, for there had never been anything like it. Edward Montaigne saw the film as a boy on its original release in 1925.
There was one spot in the picture where Mary Philbin takes the mask off and the screen is full of this horrible face. I saw the picture once and I almost ran out of the theater. Went back again with a friend of mine, Russie McCoy, and I started to build this moment to Russie. And he sat there and we waited and he said how close we to that moment, how close we, and I'm getting close. And just as we got to it, he says, I've got to see my mother. Walked out of the theater. Chaney frightened people, there's no question about it. He was a genius.
This man, Lon Chaney, can best be described as someone who acted out our psyche. He somehow got into the shadows inside our bodies. He was able to nail down some of our secret fears and put them on the screen.
We would go wanting to have the hell scared out of us, and he usually accomplished it. We would always try to pick a seat near the front so the image would be bigger and would scare us more.
You couldn't help but laugh at Lon Chaney. I guess people don't realize that today. You know, all the monsters, the makeup that he did all the time. But he was actually a very, to me, a very happy-go-lucky man.
The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and that wonderful makeup, and his stature, and it reminds me of a dancer. He just dances through things.
Lon Chaney was remarkable in that he did his own makeup. If he had lived, he probably, to my mind, would have played Frankenstein and would have been Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
But Chaney was a great deal more than a makeup artist. He was an actor of great power, enormous eloquence. Certainly I've never heard a tribute to Chaney of anything like the dimensions he deserves.
Chaney's career has obsessed another makeup man. No less than 3 books have been written about him by a Hollywood makeup expert who spent 25 years on the task, Michael F. Blake.
My first taste of Chaney was watching a very snowy print on public television station, watching Shadows, and I was about 12 years old at the time. But somehow, some way, that marvelous word we call charisma and chemistry with the camera, he just reached out and I got hooked. What's amazing is people think today that Lon Chaney is a horror actor. But Chaney wasn't just a horror actor. You know, he could play anything. He was Hollywood's first character star.
Chaney gave such life and depth to his characterizations that his films are invariably more than just melodramas.
There was a scene in The Shock where he's sitting in his wheelchair and he thinks he's injured his girlfriend and she's being taken away. And the expression on his face, it was so sad. It said everything. It said sorrow, regret, pity, everything. After that, every afflicted person, every cripple has been special to me because of Lon. I think he tried to convey that no matter how bad a person is, no matter how bad a villain is, there is always some good in him.
One or two of his performances may seem old-fashioned now, but most are as realistic as Humphrey Bogart, whom he sometimes resembles. Yet he is remembered mainly for the fact that he frightened people.
Lon Chaney's gonna get you if you don't watch out.
Colorado Springs is now a modern industrial town of 300,000. When Leonidas Chaney was born there in 1883, the population was a mere 6,000. In this colorful mining town, his maternal grandparents had founded a school for the deaf, which is still there today. His parents were deaf mutes. Frank had met his mother, Emma, when she was working at the deaf school, and they settled in the town. Years later, when Frank Chaney had moved to Los Angeles, he lived in this house opposite Malcolm Sabiston, a child actor in silent comedies. Lon Chaney used to visit Malcolm at the studio and watch him work because the boy was friendly with his stepmother, Cora, also a deaf mute.
I liked her very much. I got started going over there when the other kids wouldn't go over there because they were afraid of her. She was some kind of a, excuse the expression, a monster. And they would stand around on the side, looking around the trees at her and everything. But I was curious. I wandered up there onto the porch. And she'd go in the house, come back out with a cookie. Several times he was over there, and he'd have a cookie along with us. So I believe that he came down to the studio because I cared for his stepmother.
Lon Chaney always said his childhood was reasonably happy, but he had a difficult time.
The first part of his life, from what I understand, has been passed down through the family. He didn't speak for the first several years of his life because he grew up in this world of silence outside of, the children. Let me state, the children didn't have any affliction as far as deafness goes. So the noise around the house was only by the children. The parents were quite silent.
Lon Chaney's education at the Lincoln School came to an abrupt end when he was only 9. His mother fell ill. The family was living in this house on West Bijou Street, and Lon had to look after his brother and sister, but above all, his mother.
Due to the fact she had a rheumatism, and not only she was bedridden, but she could no longer use her hands for sign language, so their only contact was through the eyes.
Growing up in a deaf family was probably one of the best training grounds for Chaney because, as the deaf people say, he had a deaf face. You use your whole body, you use your face, your hands, you communicate everything because you don't have the ability to speak or hear.
At the Opera House, his older brother was a stagehand, and Lon joined him in 1902. It was here that he first began to act. As a comedian, he is irresistible, said his first review, which also praised his dancing. He toured the Midwest in one-night stands. In 1905, he reached Oklahoma City and met a 15-year-old singer who came to an audition and ended up marrying him. Cleaver Creighton wanted to become a dancer, but couldn't dance, and Chaney did his best to teach her. They went on tour together.
Before they knew it, they had to return to Oklahoma City because she became pregnant. And the birth of my grandfather, whose real name Most people know him as Lon Chaney Jr. His real name was Creighton Chaney. He was born on February 10th, 1906.
I was born dead. I was born black and dead. My father happened to be the midwife. My poor mother gave birth to me at 7 months. Well, Dad, not knowing what to do better, took me outside. This was in February, imagine. In Oklahoma, it's very cold. He took me outside to the edge of the lake, cracked off the ice, dunked me in, and brought me to life.
Until the baby was strong enough, Chaney took a job in a furniture store, then returned to the theater.
These barnstorming tours that they would go out on sometimes and often went broke when they were out on the road. So not only did they not get paid for their performances, they had no money to get back home.
If you had a nickel, you could buy a beer, and that would entitle you to go to the free lunch and have all you wished. Well, while Dad was getting his beer, I'd go down and get underneath the free lunch. Of course, I wasn't tall enough to come above the counter, and the bartender couldn't see me. So Dad would get his beer, and instead of drinking it, he would take his time and come down to the free lunch. Then he'd start making big sandwiches, such sandwiches, and he'd act like he was going to eat them, but then he'd hand them down underneath like that. Bang, I'd grab them into the pocket. We did this as long as we dared, till the pockets were bulging. Then we'd leave.
When he did get work, Chaney not only acted, he was choreographer, wardrobe supervisor, and stage manager. But the marriage was endangered by Cleaver's flirtatiousness.
Cleaver was very headstrong, and so was Lon. Jealousies arose, so he was teaching ballet dances and working with the female roles as well. So I'm sure lots of misunderstandings.
And by the time they came out to Los Angeles, Cleaver was still performing with him in various shows, but then she started to branch out. She took a singing job at one of the local cabarets in Los Angeles, and she became very, very popular, more so than Chaney did. And that caused a lot of problems, as well as with the fact that in order to be very popular with the cabaret crowd, a woman would have to sit at the table with whoever was there, share drinks, and obviously there were a lot of well-dressed men and a lot of drinks going around, and unfortunately she developed a very bad habit of drinking.
When Chaney prepared to leave with the Kolb and Dill Company, they had a furious argument about who was to look after Creighton. Cleaver refused.
She had been on some various medicines that were prescribed for her nerves at that time, and she went. I think they couldn't resolve this. They had separated for a time before this event took place. They tried to reconcile.
So after she finished her show, she walked over to the Majestic Theater in downtown Los Angeles, and standing in the wings of the theater, swallowed a vial of bichloride of mercury. It didn't kill her, but it did kill her singing career. And they separated in May after Chaney was assured that she would survive.
After the separation, the Cheneys were divorced, and Lon never met or spoke about Cleaver again. Once the newspapers printed details of the scandal, Chaney could not stay in the theater. He was forced into the moving picture business. By coincidence, one of his early films shows him as a reporter, working for a sensation-hungry newspaper. He comes to the aid of a girl reporter, upset at orders to ruin a woman's reputation. Chaney helps her to save it. His earliest films were made at the first studio to open in Hollywood, Nestor, at Sunset and Gower. He began as an extra, but soon won more substantial parts. Here, with Agnes Vernon, he stages a rape scene, which was alarmingly realistic for 1914. Universal moved out to the San Fernando Valley, and in 1915, a much bigger studio was opened, Universal City. Chaney became one of hundreds of actors trying to get work, but he had the edge on the rest because of his skill with makeup. This was the makeup case he used at Universal. It was an ordinary lunchbox, but out of it, Chaney conjured an extraordinary gallery. He had his makeups photographed so that he could judge what worked and what didn't on film. These were stills Chaney sent home to his brother. Sometimes he was recognizable, but often he had to indicate which part he played. I was playing a wild man. This is me, just below the X sign. Here I am a Russian prince. The films from Chaney's early career were almost all destroyed by Universal to recover the silver. Of 110 films he made for the studio, only 4 exist complete. Those that survive are often ravaged copies, too shrunk sometimes to go through a printer. But archives and collectors struggle to save what they can. The National Film Archive in London saved this earliest example of Chaney playing 2 roles, both hunchbacks, one in a vision, the other, in reality, a fisherman. A collector in England rescued this film, which displays the beauty of Chaney's movements, even if the acting style belongs to the stage. It contains the only surviving shot of Chaney dancing, all too brief. Chaney was taken up by the director Joseph de Grasse and his wife Ida May Park, also a director. De Grasse encouraged Chaney to develop his ability with bizarre characters, and together the team made more than 60 pictures. During this period, Chaney began directing films himself, and he even tried script writing. But he wasn't allowed to carry out his ideas, so he returned to acting. In The Scarlet Car, directed by de Grasse, Chaney plays an elderly bank teller who catches his employers cooking the books. Chaney had married Hazel Hastings while he was at Universal. Creighton came home from boarding school to live with them. Hazel persuaded Lon to ask Universal for a raise.
He had asked for $125 a week and a 5-year contract, and the studio manager, William Sistrom, refused. He says, "You're never going to be worth more than $100 a week."
He left, but outside Universal he endured weeks of unemployment. His career was saved by Western star William S. Hart, who gave him an important part in a film now lost. This surviving scene came from the archive in Moscow. Chaney came to public notice and began to get work. He was even employed back at Universal with a director called Todd Browning. Browning was one of the most remarkable directors of the silent era. A former carnival barker, he revealed an obsession for the morbid and bizarre. He created disturbing dramas, the stories of which he often wrote himself. His collaboration with Chaney began with this picture, long considered lost. He presented the underworld with an uncompromising toughness. He never allowed his characters to look like actors. Here he signals to his audience that Priscilla Dean is playing a streetwalker, having trouble with her shoes. He throws in a dope addict. Chaney and Priscilla Dean play hard-bitten characters who don't care if the audience thinks them obnoxious. This was startling at the time. But it was the Miracle Man that made Chaney Hollywood's most outstanding character actor. He played one of 4 crooks who tried to cash in on a series of apparent miracles performed by a blind faith healer. Director George Lone Tucker wanted a real contortionist, but none of those he found could act. Chaney did a test so convincingly, Tucker was shaken.
Everyone used to say Chaney was a contortionist or he was double-jointed. It's not true. If you really watch that on the healing sequence, when he comes up and he'll do like the handle snap out like this, or he'll snap the joint like this. It's all acting. It's all just acting.
In the story, Chaney pretends to be a crippled beggar in the process of being cured by the faith healer, the crooks ready to fleece a gullible public. Then a real miracle occurs. The Miracle Man was Paramount's biggest money maker of the year and a tremendous hit for Chaney. Chaney's fame brought him no leading man parts, but more character roles. Here he plays a Canadian trapper, supposedly lost in the mountains. Chaney loved the mountains, and location trips like this were a holiday for him. In this minor film, he plays opposite Betty Blythe. The Penalty is a forgotten masterpiece, so brutal that protests appeared in the press. Based on a novel by Gouverneur Morris, it was hardly the sort of film one associates with the Age of Innocence.
The Penalty had the censors running for their scissors as quick as they could. I mean, you had a dope fiend in it, you had a murder, you had a naked model, and you had this character who wants to cut off another man's legs and have him grafted onto his own. You watch it today and you say, it's a really powerful film. Back then, Variety said, here's a film as cheerful as a hanging.
Chaney plays Blizzard, a gangster whose legs were amputated when he was a boy by this girl's father. For Chaney, seen here with writer Gouverneur Morris, this was as important a role as the Miracle Man.
Everything he trained for, everything that he was, that he learned throughout the years, came through in this part. Chaney actually strapped his legs behind him, walked on his knees, and refused to do trick angles.
This is the back of the jacket of the costume for The Penalty.
You'll notice the lower portion here of the jacket is very long, much longer than in the front, and has a wider swoop in the back. This was designed so that Chaney could hide his bent-up legs and still appear like a real double amputee to the audience. Chaney put his bent-up legs into these leather stumps, and then the oversized pants and the oversized coat completed the effect.
The pain was so intense that Chaney could only stand wearing the stumps for 10-20 minutes at a time. Blizzard takes his revenge. He plans to have this young doctor's legs removed in an underground operating theater. Fascinated by the criminal mind, Chaney wrote articles on prison reform. He paid visits to the underworld as an observer. He was aided by law enforcement officers like William J. Burns, here visiting Chaney and Todd Browning on the set of Outside the Law.
Outside the Law has to be a turning point in the Chaney-Browning collaboration. Of course, he plays the gangster Black Mike Silva. He's vicious, he's terrible, he's villainous. He's also got a real interesting streak about him. Chaney would do certain things with his characters. And I remember once discussing this movie with a friend of mine who had seen it as a young boy. And he said, after I had told him I had seen it, he said, "Do they still have that scene where he picks up the tip?" There's a scene in the movie where they're all plotting to this setup of a murder. And so Chaney's the last to leave, and he pauses for a second, he looks down at the table, and he picks up the tip and pockets it. And it's a wonderful, it's a little piece of business. It doesn't mean anything, really, but it speaks volumes of the character. And then you look at what Browning did with the Chinese character. He had nothing to do with the story. The Ah Wing character that Chaney plays doesn't advance the story whatsoever. But Browning realized this was a good piece for Chaney. And if you compare his performance to the man who plays Chang Lo in the film, who's another Caucasian actor, Chaney is more Chinese than any other Caucasian actor around.
It was courageous to make this film because of widespread prejudice against the Chinese.
They were really reviled, hated, terribly mistreated, and there were even lynchings if anyone tried to speak up or protest.
There has been a wreck off the New England seaport of Urquy, and among the survivors is a Chinese cook.
Remember how completely Lon Chaney was in that role. I remember the way he walked, as if his feet had been bound or something. He had a little, very, very characteristic and memorable way that he walked. Aside from all the makeup, of course he was made up to look Chinese, but all of the body language, the sort of humility that I remember the sort of bent way that he was. He didn't have to say anything. He didn't have to have dialogue. You just felt him. You felt his presence.
Bud Schulberg was a boy of 8 when he visited the set. The film was directed by Tom Foreman, seated, and produced by Bud Schulberg's father, B.P. Schulberg. It may not have been a box office sensation, but it was selected as one of the best pictures of 1922.
It was a very daring for then, and it still would be, I think, if they made it now. Chaney was so sympathetic in the role that he was able to make a connection with the audience that even people who might come in the theater hating the Chinese would come out with a different feeling that these were really, these people were human beings also.
It amazed me that this guy I had seen in pictures wearing a cap and a suit and a tie, and suddenly he's bent over and he looks like a Chinese, he acts like a Chinese character. That's what one reviewer said one time in the 1920s. What else can this guy do?
The role of Fagin in Oliver Twist went automatically to Lon Chaney. The title role was played by Jackie Coogan.
When we hired him to play Fagin, we hired the outstanding actor, both in ability to play anything and the ability to look like anything. When it came time to do his stuff with me, we went to work like on a Monday morning, and I met him for the first time, and we got up and rehearsed this scene. It was the pickpocket scene where Fagin teaches Oliver how to pickpocket. And my dad told me before that, he said, watch him. He said, he's a thief. He'll steal the whole scene from you. Be careful, do every trick. But we rehearsed, and we shot it in the first take. The only thing he ever said to me is after that, he came over after we had done the scene, and he says, hey, kid, you're all right. But he gave a wonderful performance.
The same could not be said of this film, which began life as The Heart of a Wolf, with the highest credentials. Its story co-authored by Lon Chaney and Irving Thalberg, the young head of production at Universal. But the company saved money on the director, who wasn't up to the task. Chaney always said he needed direction despite his experience, otherwise he might overact. Retitled The Trap, it was the first film to be advertised with this famous slogan. The Shock was another for Universal, but it came in for severe criticism. Irving Thalberg received from studio boss Carl Laemmle a letter saying how disappointed he had been by The Shock and The Trap. I say to you, Irving, I'm worried about the future. I'm not going to see you produce any more flivvers. It has always been thought that the idea of making The Hunchback of Notre Dame was Irving Thalberg's, but Michael Blake found that Alfred Grasso, Chaney's business manager, had kept papers proving otherwise.
Well, Hollywood history has been rewritten because Lon Chaney, like a lot of stars back then, was looking to find material for himself, and he actually optioned the right to Hunchback of Notre Dame and was trying to find financing for the picture.
It eventually came to Thalberg, and he convinced Laemmle. The extent of Chaney's involvement has never before been realized. It ranged from who would direct, to who would write, and who would play Esmeralda. Thalberg had recent experience in making epics. His baptism of fire had been Foolish Wives, for which Erich von Stroheim had rebuilt Monte Carlo, and had gone on shooting until the costs rose close to $1 million. Behind the set of the Foolish Wives Casino rose a more economical set for the Cathedral of Notre Dame. It would be combined with a miniature to amaze audiences, just as Chaney himself would startle the world with his most extreme makeup yet. Chaney's inspiration came from an illustrated edition of Victor Hugo's novel. It meant that he had to alter his whole body. Making up took 3 hours a day and was extremely uncomfortable. Patsy Ruth Miller played Esmeralda.
I felt that he almost relished that pain because it gave him that feeling that he wanted to have of a tortured creature.
He did obviously suffer a great deal of discomfort, but a lot of the myths behind Chaney are just that, myths. There's no truth that he was a masochist. He was very proud of his work. He was very professional about his work, but he would never endanger himself to the point that he'd hurt his body, that he would never work again. I mean, it's foolish when you really think about it. Everyone said he wore a 70-pound rubber hump, and it's not true. It was 5 to 20 pounds, and it was made out of plaster. And it fit on a harness that he wore on his back, similar to a backpack, attached around the waist. And up on the upper portion of the breastplate area, he had some ropes. And he would take the rope, and he'd bend down and tie himself here, so he would be in a stooped position.
Chaney got his friend Wallace Worsley as director. Worsley had done The Penalty and 3 other Chaney productions.
Wallace Worsley was the director, but in my opinion, Lon directed it more than Worsley did. One of the things that I learned about acting from him was that you don't have to feel the emotion enough to really cry real tears or tear yourself apart. I don't think he would have approved of the School of Acting bit. What he kept saying to me, remember, you are an actress, and an actress's job is to make the audience feel. Doesn't matter whether you're torn apart inside. If you do not tear the audience apart, you are not playing the part well.
He convinced me, even though I was 3 years old, that there was a hunchback somewhere in me. There was a shadow of this hunchback, even though I was a normal kid. But my feelings for him were so terrific that I burst into tears.
Every available arc light in Hollywood was used to illuminate the massive night scenes. Quasimodo is besieged in the cathedral with Esmeralda as the Paris mob rises.
It was something people hadn't seen before. You know, this was medieval Paris and all the sets and the crowds, and here you have this hunchback character that people love. People feel sorry for when he doesn't get the girl. And when he dies at the end and he's ringing the bells, you know, he's ringing his own death knell. It was a tremendous performance.
The Hunchback established Chaney as Hollywood's outstanding character star. His modest announcement that he was now at liberty was followed by a picture for Paramount and then one for a new company, Metro-Goldwyn, occupying the old Goldwyn studio at Culver City. In charge of production, Irving Thalberg. But MGM insisted on publicity, while Chaney was ambivalent about it.
Chaney's approach to publicity was, I get more publicity if I say nothing and do nothing than if I stood there and smiled. For instance, a prime example is the 1925 MGM studio tour, which was made for the stockholders of Lowe's Incorporated. And they had all the MGM stars assembled on the front lawn in front of the dressing room row, and the camera pans by and you see Norma Shearer, John Gilbert, and everybody in it. And then as we come towards the end here, here's this guy with his back to the camera, and he's in a very animated conversation. And he turns just ever so briefly so you get a quick look at the face, and then turns back. And that was Chaney.
He had embarked on a rare publicity tour for Hunchback, and thrilled this boy when his picture appeared in the papers. But he avoided interviewers, and the press regarded him as a man of mystery. Between pictures, he used to say, there is no Lon Chaney.
He was what I would call a self-enclosed man, if you know what I mean. Not that he wasn't outgoing in many ways. He was very sweet. He was easy to chat with if you got him in the right mood, when he wasn't thinking of his part. But he did not enter into Hollywood as such. I don't recall us ever being at any parties, and I don't think that many people knew much about his private life. He kept it private. His private life was private.
There are few personal photographs. Even these shots of his farewell to Hazel and Creighton were taken on the Hunchback tour. There are shots of him clowning on the set with Wallace Beery. A few snapshots show him on holiday in the mountains. He built a cabin in the woods at Big Pine. And there are home movies, taken by his friends, the Dumphys. Here, Chaney clowns with his wife, Hazel. The other man is William Dunphy. Little is known about Hazel, but they were a devoted couple. Chaney was so keen on filmmaking that he bought one of the first 16mm cameras. This still is the only evidence of his filmmaking. The footage he shot has disappeared. Chaney was no recluse. Here he is with Western star Harry Carey, with director Clarence Brown, with the new actress Greta Garbo. Chaney stood up for the best interests of the crews he worked with, and was generous with money and advice. One man he helped was Boris Karloff.
He, of all people, gave him the best single piece of advice he had ever been given. It was at a time when my father was certainly an unknown, struggling actor, and a bit discouraged. And Chaney Sr. gave him a lift home. And in the car, my father was asking his advice, and Chaney Sr. said to him, "The best advice I can give you is to find something no one else can do, and do it better than anybody else can do it. And you'll leave your mark."
Chaney was Metro-Goldwyn's first star in the company's first film. His director was from Sweden, Victor Seastrom. Chaney co-starred with Norma Shearer and John Gilbert. The clown takes revenge on the men who have betrayed him. Tully Marshall as the Count. Mark McDermott as the Baron. Chaney plays a scientist in the Andreev play. His discoveries are presented to the Academy by his sponsor, the Baron. The scientist joins a circus using the slap as his act. The clown sees the Baron among the audience. He falls in love with the bareback rider, played by Norma Shearer.
When he confesses his love to her, she thinks he's kidding and she slaps him. And he's devastated and your heart breaks. You're going, oh my God. You feel terrible for him. But that was a credit to Chaney's talent, that he was able to reach in and get the audience's sympathy.
The history of Lon Chaney is the history of a sequence of unrequited loves in film after film after film. He brings that part of you out in the open because you fear that you are not loved. You fear that you never will be loved. You fear there's some part of you that's grotesque, that the world will turn away from. I think that's the quality that puts Lon Chaney above almost all the stars of his time.
In The Unholy Three, the girl Chaney loves comes back to him as she promised, and he lets her go. Her gratitude is profound as she leaves for the man she really loves. Todd Browning had great difficulty selling the project, but it turned out to be one of the most successful films of the year, restoring Browning's reputation. He was back with the world he knew so well, a world of carnivals, freaks, and sideshows. The scriptwriter was Valdemar Young, who adapted 8 of the Chaney-Browning films. Chaney was at the peak of his talent as Echo, the ventriloquist. The Unholy Three. Echo, played by Chaney, a strong man, Victor McLaglen, a midget, Harry Earls, concoct the perfect crime. They open a bird store as a front. Mrs. O'Grady runs it. The old lady and the baby add a charming domestic touch. Nobody would suspect these gentle people of robbery or murder. In a scene with Matthew Betts as a detective, Chaney's expressions enhance the suspense. For the stolen jewels are in the elephant. This is Lon Chaney in a 1918 propaganda film with Rupert Julian as the Kaiser. Julian never got over the Prussian officer pose and maintained it even while directing The Phantom of the Opera at Universal. There were rumors of tension between Julian and Chaney, but were they true?
Oh, I know the problems with Chaney and Julian were true. Charles Van Enger, the cameraman, told me that they just hated each other. Julian wanted a much broader performance than what Chaney had in mind for his character. And Julian, kind of coming off of replacing von Stroheim in the merry-go-round, probably thought, he was as good as von Stroheim, if not better. And the relationship between Chaney and Julian quickly went downhill.
Nonetheless, Julian did a remarkable job. The Phantom is at first sketched in by suggestion. People thought Universal mad. Were they really paying Chaney to play a shadow?
I mean, you can always tell Chaney, no matter how much makeup he's got on, you can tell it's Chaney by the use of his hands. They were like music.
Some scenes were done in various color processes, Handschigel and Technicolor.
There were certain scenes in all of his films that he knew were set pieces, like on top of the opera house, late at night when the lovers are up there, and they think they've escaped the Phantom, but he's above them in the wind. Or the moment when the Phantom comes down the stairs and freezes the people at the Mask of the Red Death. And then at the very end of the film, when the Phantom confronts the crowd and he rears back and he's got what they think might be a hand grenade or something in one hand, and he threatens them with a clenched fist, and they all pull back. And then he opens his hand and laughs to show that he terrified them with nothing. That metaphor is the whole of Lon Chaney. For a whole lifetime, he threatened you with his closed fist, and you knew there was something terrible in there, and at the very end of his life, went like that. And you saw there was nothing there at all, but you'd been terrified for no reason.
Chaney's contract prescribed all photographs of the unmasked Phantom to ensure the strongest possible impact in the theater.
Well, a lot of people say that the makeup caused him great pain and great difficulty, but it's not true.
The secret lay in a small, leather-covered box.
This was Lon Chaney's makeup box. To many makeup artists, this is the Holy Grail. This is the makeup case that he created his 1,000 faces with. He started using this case in 1919 and used it until his death in 1930. It was originally a mechanic's toolbox.
With these simple devices, Chaney created one of the most frightening faces ever put on the screen. He prepared much of his makeup on this wax model of his head, using cotton and collodion to create face pieces.
And as far as the nose, he took a strip of fish skin, which is a thin, transparent material, that he would glue here on his nose with spirit gum, pull the nose up to whatever length or width he'd want, and then run it up the bridge of the nose and up under the skull cap, so you'd have that effect.
No one thought Chaney could ever improve on that. One of the very few who ever saw the makeup develop was assistant director Willard Sheldon, who watched him create an aged Chinese for an MGM film called Mr. Wu.
So what he did, he got on a streetcar and he took a seat at the back end of the streetcar. He stayed in that streetcar till it reached the end of the line. He didn't care where it was going. At the end of that time, not one person took him for anything but what he appeared to be, an old Chinese laundryman.
In the film, the makeup became that of a 100-year-old Mandarin. In the same picture, he played his own grandson, young and middle-aged.
And my grandfather talks about remembering him going up into his room and secluding himself and calling him up occasionally and saying, "Hey, what do you think of this?" You know, or what? And he would certainly go through a lot of pains to perfect the role.
Out of a small little kit, these 1,000 faces emerged. It was just incredible the way he changed himself.
But then Chaney made Tell It to the Marines with William Haynes.
This was the movie that proved Lon Chaney did not need makeup to prove that he was a good actor and he was a box office star. Chaney is just phenomenal in it. He is the character that you see in later films like To the Shores of Tripoli, Sands of Iwo Jima, the tough Marine sergeant who's going to mold this wise-mouthed, smart-aleck kid into a real Marine. And despite him being so hard and so gruff, he's really got a heart of gold underneath.
Eleanor Boardman played a nurse who cares for both men, while the sergeant conceals his love for her.
Everybody praised it. I mean, the reviews for this film were across the board very, very positive. And I think the best review that was ever written for the film came in Leatherneck magazine, which was for the Marine Corps. And they said that in Chaney's performance, we saw every sergeant we knew. He was the living, breathing embodiment of that tough Marine sergeant. And so much so, the Marines loved his performance that he became the first motion picture actor to be made an honorary member of the United States Marine Corps.
This was one of Chaney's favorite films, according to his wife, and he and Hazel made a rare attendance at the premiere. MGM's new star, Lucille Lesueur, seen here with designer Erte, was chosen for Chaney's The Unknown. By now, her name had been changed to Joan Crawford. It was a reunion for Chaney with his old friend Todd Browning, and it was one of their strangest productions. Crawford played Nanon, the daughter of the owner of a circus in Spain. Chaney was Alonzo the Armless, a knife thrower deeply in love with Nanon. But Nanon has a fear of being touched by men. Norman Kerry, as Malabar, the strong man, is baffled by her rejection. She feels at ease with Alonzo. Incredibly, Chaney is doing this trick with a real armless body double providing the legs. Alonzo seems a pleasant enough man who puts up with this situation until his secret is revealed. Alonzo is a murderer on the run. He hides his arms because of a congenital defect that would immediately incriminate him. And now Nanon has seen those double thumbs. He visits a surgeon and blackmails him into removing his arms.
Burt Lancaster told me when I was working with him once, we got talking about Chaney. And Burt Lancaster said, the scene where Chaney realizes he's cut his arms off for nothing was the most emotionally compelling scene he's ever seen an actor do. And it is, when you realize that it's basically shot in a medium close-up. He doesn't use his hands, it's his face. And you can feel the emotional intensity. It just comes right up from the gut.
London After Midnight is a lost film, the most eagerly sought after of all the missing Cheneys.
I saw London After Midnight. Lon played a straight part of a detective who dresses up as a vampire, and the vampire is terrible because he had a huge grin, long hair and a top hat, and walked along in a sort of crawling way.
I'm convinced that Groucho Marx saw the film and patterned himself after Lon Chaney, that kind of a crouch he had and the way he went around. And if you'd see it today, you may say, well, he's mimicking Groucho Marx.
And he certainly did a mysterious glide up from the ceiling, I think, in the room to terrify somebody or other.
That was a fantasy. It was so unreal, but the makeup was terrific.
He had thin wires that fitted around his eyes so that it would give this hypnotic stare. Then he had a set of upper and lower false teeth. The upper portion had a wire that would hold the corners of his mouth open to give it kind of a fixated grin. And that was it, and a wig, and the characterization itself.
One tends to get excited about lost films. I think people would be very disappointed if they saw London After Midnight. I didn't enjoy it anything like as much as The Phantom.
It was so fantastic and unreal that you couldn't take it seriously.
The people who made it obviously didn't, and yet it was blamed for a murder in London. A man said he had been so terrified by Chaney, he had had a fit and murdered a woman in Hyde Park. His defense was rejected. Laugh, Clown, Laugh saw Chaney cast again as a clown, Tito. It was the Pagliacci story directed by the veteran Herbert Brennan. Tito performs a hazardous act. Chaney was always doubled for scenes like this. This was said to have been the favorite of all his roles, the clown who loves the girl who loves someone else. Tito had found the girl abandoned as a child and brings her up in the circus. Herbert Brennan was a dedicated filmmaker who found himself directing an inexperienced actress in her first featured role, Loretta Young, aged 14, whose real name was Gretchen.
It seemed he had to have a patsy. Naturally, he picked on the most vulnerable one, and I was it. He'd call me in, Gretchen, come here. And I'd stand there, and he said, I don't know what ever gave you the idea that you could ever be an actress. You would rip me up one side and on the other, and he would do it at least twice a week. But never when Lon Chaney was on the set. The minute Lon would come on the set, he said, all right, ready. All right, Gretchen, go to the dressing room, get yourself fixed up. As long as Chaney was around, he behaved. And I didn't know anything about acting. Anyway, Chaney saw that. From then on, he never left the stage while I was working, ever. But he really directed me. He did it in such a manner that nobody else knew it. I don't think even Brennan was conscious of it.
Alongside the tragedy, there was often humor in Chaney's roles. Chaney plays Froso, a magician who loves his wife and is horrified when she leaves him for Crane, played by Lionel Barrymore. His wife returns, but dies and leaves Froso with her daughter. He brings the girl up in the worst of the African brothels, for he knows her to be Crane's. The girl was played by Mary Nolan. Froso repeats his stage act for the benefit of Crane, who remembers it from all those years ago. Froso tells him it is his daughter.
Chaney goes from one end here where he's taking sheer delight, and you see it go across the spectrum to the horrendous realization that it's his daughter he's put through this. tears well up in his eyes, and he's clutching at his throat. And I mean, even though this is a silent film, you can hear the wail that he's giving out.
While the City Sleeps was a character study of a detective close to retirement.
Whatever it is he's doing, he has the command of that skill. It looks like this character has been doing whatever it's been doing for years.
Chaney's policeman behaved as in real life, not as glamorized for the screen. His character is secretly in love with the girl, Anita Page, but he tries to keep to a fatherly concern, brilliantly caught in this scene. Gangster films had been given a boost by the success of Paramount's thriller Underworld, so this MGM film tried to outdo the climactic gunfight. Lon Chaney's final silent film proved to be Thunder. It has also been lost for many years. He played Grumpy Anderson, an old-time engineer who will take his train through hell or high water, but refuses to hitch on a private car for a nightclub singer. She rides on the footplate with his son, the fireman.
To make his character real, he found a pair of overalls that one old train engineer was wearing, and he made a deal with him. I'll buy you a brand new pair if you give me yours so I can wear it in the movie. And it looked worn, and it was beaten up, and it looked lived in. There again, he just looks like an old train engineer. He just fits the part. He looks like he just got off the steam locomotive.
After an accident, Anderson is retired to the machine shop, where he is reunited with the remains of his engine. But it was a very trying film for Chaney. When he went on location from the warmth of California to Green Bay, Wisconsin, it was snowing. He caught a cold but kept on working in true Chaney fashion. The cold developed into walking pneumonia.
He would, some mornings he'd show up very late, very apologetic. Nobody really knew how sick he was. And finally, as the picture neared an end, he had to stay out for several days at a time. And finally, the picture was shut down, I forget, I think for a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, and then picked up again. But I don't think anybody on the company realized how terribly sick he was.
All right, everybody quiet, please. After the bell.
Sound had arrived, and Chaney resisted it. He wouldn't talk, he said, because it might destroy the mystery. MGM made a musical with all their stars except Garbo and Chaney, but Chaney had a number devoted to him.
Lon Chaney's gonna get you if you don't watch out.
The Phantom of the Opera was reissued with sound, but the Phantom did not speak. Universal wanted him urgently for Dracula. MGM gave Chaney a large bonus for signing a new contract, and Irving Thalberg chose his first sound film.
And so they picked The Unholy Three as Chaney's talking picture debut. And in reality, it was probably a good choice, because it gives Chaney the chance to now become
The man of 100 golden voices, Professor Echo.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you. Now, folks, if you'll just gather around a little closer now. Come right in a little closer. That's it. That's fine. That's fine, folks. Now, then, if you'll be real quiet, I'll see if I can get the little boy to say something.
Chaney had to sign an affidavit that all 5 voices were his, and not the work of voice doubles. He threw his voice, he imitated the girl, and even a parrot. As Mrs. O'Grady, he didn't try to fake the voice, he just spoke softly and chose the words carefully.
Oh, Rosie, will you come here, please? All right. Come right in, Rosie.
What's the big idea?
What's eating you now?
You're making a play for that guy.
Don't be silly. I like him because he hands me a laugh.
Yeah? Well, you keep on and I'll hand you a laugh. You get that?
In the courtroom, Mrs. O'Grady is under intense cross-examination.
Do you? In short, Mrs. O'Grady, you don't remember anything else except what you want to remember, do you?
Oh, I have such a headache.
Well, I'm sorry, Mrs. O'Grady, if you have a headache.
Thank you.
I didn't mean to make you nervous.
Oh, it's much better now, thank you.
You see, I'm only attempting to drive at the truth.
Yes, of course.
Now, Mrs. O'Grady. See, Your Honor? An imposter, an osprey.
Order in the court.
And then, of course, at the ending was reshot. Originally, the ending was like in the silent version, where Chaney goes back to the sideshow. Rosie comes up and says, I'm going to fulfill my part of the bargain. And Echo realizes that she really loves Hector. He says, no, you go on. And as she starts to leave, he has the dummy, says, goodbye, old pal. And she turns around, and he's holding the dummy in his lap, and he waves the dummy's arm. And as she leaves, the dummy comes to Chaney's chest, and he puts his head down, and he begins to cry. And I talked with a man who happened to be working at MGM at the time, who just happened to sneak in on the set at that point. And he said Chaney cried real tears, like you wouldn't believe.
In the final scene, as reshot, Echo says farewell at the railroad station to Hector, Elliot Nugent, and Rosie, Lila Lee. By now, Chaney knew he had lung cancer.
Well, I guess Rosie wants to talk to you now, so I'll say goodbye.
Well, goodbye, kid. Good luck.
Irony of ironies. Here's the man who is, through this film, Harry Earls told me he was struggling to get along because of his health. There were some days where he just didn't have the energy to get through the day. And Hector, as a way of saying thank you, gives him a carton of cigarettes.
I brought you some cigarettes.
Oh, swell. Thanks, kid.
I don't know whether to laugh or cry.
Well, why don't you do a little of both? You know the old gag. That's all there is to life. Just a little laugh, a little tear. I'll send you a postal card.
It fades to black and we see the end. That was Lon's last performance on the silver screen.
7 weeks after the film was released, Chaney died. He was 47 years old.
I remember it was my father saw it first on the placards, because it was quite a sensation when, and when he came in with the news, I couldn't take it in. I did think the end of the world had come. No more Lon.
The day he died, when I was 10 years old, was the end of the world. I thought, my God, Lon Chaney died here in 1930, and I'm only 10 years old. If he can die, that means me too. Huh? Nothing's safe. If this great man, this man taller than all the buildings in the world, who represents all the people in the world, if he can be taken away by death, then I'm vulnerable. And that was a terrible feeling to have.
The funeral service was held at the Cunningham and O'Connor Funeral Home in downtown Los Angeles. The eulogy was given by the chaplain of the Marine Corps base at San Diego. Hazel Chaney was in a state of collapse.
All studios in Hollywood halted work to observe a moment of silence. And at MGM, they had a color guard there from the Marine Corps, and they blew taps as the Marines lowered the flag to half-staff.
Chaney was interred at Forest Lawn Cemetery at Glendale. No one knows the reason, but his crypt bears no name. Lon Chaney attains immortality, said a Screen magazine at the time. No man in pictures, nor woman either, has won the wide space in the popular heart that Chaney could call his own. There never was an actor whose every gesture carried more feeling, more eloquence than Chaney. He will be missed not only by the producers, but by the millions who took him into their hearts.